welcome you to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast, and today we're looking at Job chapter 2. And the text reads, "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord." We've seen the mischief that came from the day before when he came before God, and he clearly accuses the brothers, as we're told, is his nature. And the Lord actually offered up Job as an example of someone who held fast to his integrity. And Satan proposed to hit him in all of his family and property, and the things that he loved the most. And it turned out that he loved God even more, and blessed God in the loss of all of that. And so another day is to come when the sons of God, including Satan, present themselves to the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it." It's almost formulaic. It's exactly like it was presented before. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" And then he adds this, as that was said before, "He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." Now that language presents a number of problems, a number of theological problems. What does it mean that Satan incited God? And what does it mean that God says, "You caused me to destroy him without cause"? Is there injustice with God? Well, the obvious answer to that, the answer that Job would be the first to assert, is no, there can be no injustice with God. So we have to expound this in a way that would lead us to that conclusion, or simply declare that it is mystery, and we are not prepared at this point to be able to understand it, although in faith we know that God is not the author of evil and cannot be charged with evil. But that is a difficult concept. It's not an easy one, certainly. He holds fast, God says about Job, to his integrity, and that word is the word of purity. It's the use of, this is an animal that is fit for sacrifice. He holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him. Now that word, "you incited me," is interesting. The Hebrew word is sut, and it occurs in two contexts that are very instructive. It has to do with David and the sin of the census. It was sinful for him to number the people. That was forbidden. It was a way of finding out how strong his kingdom was, when really all of his trust should have been in God, irrespective of the numbers of those he could muster. And so this account of the sin of the census, it was toward the end of David's life. It's given in 1 Chronicles 24:1, where it says, "The day came when Satan incented David to number the people." Satan stirred him up. But in the parallel passage in 2 Samuel 24:1, that chronicler says that God is the one who incited David to number the people. I think I said incite. That's the meaning is to stir up. And so how is it possible that both Satan and God could use the same predicate? Who is the one who incited David to number the people, which is sinful? Was it God or was it Satan? And I think this is the same word that's used here, although God is charging Satan with having incited him against Job to destroy him without cause. Now we'll come to that last clause, to destroy him without cause, but I'm interested in this word incited. So who incited David? Was it God or was it Satan? And clearly, on the strength of the text, it was both. Then how does that work? Obviously, Satan is the implement of evil. He is the agent who accomplishes what God intended. God incited him ultimately. But Satan is the one who actually does the inciting. So he is the culpable agent who brought about the sin of David. But God purposed it. And I think this brings us back to the conundrum that we have about all of the sufferings of Joseph at the hand of his brothers. My goodness, at the end of Joseph's life, he makes the comment to his brothers because they were riddled with guilt and ill feeling one toward the other. And he receives them in full forgiveness once his tests are completed and he learns that they have learned to love one another in faith and that their faith is authentic. He forgives them fully. And he makes a very curious declaration, but it's absolutely magnificent. He says, he warns them not to lapse into that kind of thinking of that deep guilt and grief, because there's been full forgiveness and restitution. They are all the 12 sons of Jacob are embracing when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And that embrace of the 12 sons of Jacob after all of that sin has now been forgiven is one of the first pictures we have of heaven, because that becomes the 12 gates named after these same brothers who are embracing each other, Judah even and Joseph on opposite ends, Joseph in the west and Judah in the east. But the gates of the heavenly Jerusalem are named after these 12 brothers embracing themselves. And Joseph's lesson from all of that is that what they had intended for evil and was culpable with them, God had also intended. He intended to bring Joseph down there in order to save their lives in the time of famine that God foresaw that was coming upon the whole region. And so in order to do that, his purposes were to bring Joseph to Egypt and raise him up, and by that means to deliver not only Israel, but also the nations around as he gave them bread. So God intended a good outcome. The brothers intended an evil outcome. But God, in doing that, is simply exercising his sovereignty. He is not actually accomplishing or doing evil. He cannot be charged with evil. We know that from James. We know that from the New Testament. You certainly cannot charge God with evil. And we know that from Romans 9. Paul makes that very clear. That's not man's role. God does not answer to our bar of justice. There is mystery here, and mystery is something that cannot be explained, not in the rational horizons of this particular world. And I think this is something similar. God intends it, but he intends it for wholly good purposes, not for evil purposes. He has wholly good purposes in bringing Job through this extraordinary, excruciating testing. The word excruciating, I think, is appropriate here. The word literally in Latin, ex crucis. Crux is a cross, and crucis is the genitive form of that. Excruciating is pain that is like that from coming from the cross. Job is clearly a type of Christ in all of his many sufferings. And that was intended by men for evil was or by Satan for evil, ultimately spoke to the purposes of God to bring good. The greatest good, I think, that probably came out of Job's suffering is this book itself. I mentioned last time that the message of suffering is one that's universal. A message of comfort in suffering is one that's universal. Christ spoke of the whole trajectory of suffering to glory as being the comprehensive movement, narrative movement of all of the Bible, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. It was necessary for the Christ to suffer and then enter into his glory. And so we will see that in this book as well, but this book is bringing that gospel message to all the earth. And how many people in times of extraordinary, excruciating suffering have turned to this book to find comfort. We may not find in our greatest hours of suffering a full answer, but we have to understand that through our suffering, God is accomplishing his good purposes. He had a purpose in giving Paul that thorn, whatever that was, that physical suffering that he endured. But he also sustained him in going through that suffering, which was made him more like Christ and in the image of Christ, by giving him grace that was sufficient. And he knew what measure of grace Paul would need in order to sustain that. It's the same for all of us. And so Job is holding fast. He will not be shaken from the idea that God is good. When the enemy comes, he always is impugning God's motives. When he's in the first temptation of mankind, when he speaks to the woman, he says, "You will not die if you partake of this tree." But God knows that God is really jealous of you. He knows that in the day you eat of it, you will be like him. You will transcend your creatureliness and become like a higher order of being. And so he's always impugning God. God can't possibly be loving. And much evil comes from that. God can't possibly be loving. Well, God is loving, but he may be testing us because sometimes we can only see by faith that he is loving. We can't see. We can't demonstrate it by the logic of this world. And what troubles me here, or causes me a consternation, I suppose, is probably more fairly. He says, God says, "You incited me against him to destroy him without cause." That's what Satan intended, but God did have a causation in mind, and the causation was not destruction. The causation was to establish him in his righteousness and to demonstrate the level of righteousness that God in his grace had imparted or imputed to this man. And so there was a good purpose in all of that. And in that we are given tremendous lessons of perseverance and endurance. The saints will persevere, and they will persevere because of their conviction that God is kind even in the most trying circumstances. And I want to talk about that a little bit down the road. So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life." And so God before had said you can do anything to him but not touch him. And so now Satan wants to multiply his wickedness and attack the very person of Job. And he does it in the most horrible and humiliating way. "Stretch out your hand now and touch his bone." So Satan is telling God to do this. Stretch out his hand. Stretch out your hand. That's very important because we'll see that shifts in a moment. He tells God, "Stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to his face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand." Notice the difference. "But spare his life," his soul, his nephesh, his breath. You can do anything to his physical being, but you cannot take away his breath, his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. My goodness, how awful is this? He went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. That means there is no way he could ever enjoy rest. Every which way if he would attempt to sit down or to lie down, which he does, he is still resting on that which causes tremendous pain. It's the most miserable from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. This shows us something of the implacability of our enemy. What kind of a creature is Satan that he would even imagine doing such a thing? This is what comes from the hand of Satan, as we see. Not from the hand of God, but from the hand of Satan. God permits it, however, for our good. But certainly for Job, it's a great trial. He's with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself. Apparently these were running sores, which makes it even worse. It would be malodorous. It would be leave him anemic, probably infectious sores. So he would take a potsherd. Greeks call them an ostracon. You find these everywhere in the ancient East. They're just everywhere, wherever people have been. A potsherd, a piece of pottery that's broken. That would have a relatively sharp edge, but one that could be grasped easily. And he would scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. The idea of ashes here is interesting too, because that brings to mind the sixth commandment. Not the sixth commandment, the sixth plague upon Egypt. When God tells Moses to take ashes, it's a different word. This word is epher, which Isaiah uses when he says that he will give us beauty for ashes. Oh, it's interesting. Fair for ophir. It's a pun in the Hebrew text. He will give us fair for ophir. Beauty for ashes is ophir. And that's God's intention. His purpose is to take away the dust and to give us that which is beautiful, which he makes out of dust, by the way. I was struck recently thinking with all the flowers here in bloom in Florida, God brings all of these different vibrant colors and beauty, all of the leaves of the different kinds of foliage and tree, all of that diversity, and all of the human family. He brings it out of the soil of the earth. It's amazing what God does. He can bring a prism. He can bring all the colors out of the light, but he also brings all the colors out of the ground. He took for himself, Job did, a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. And so it's like plagues are being brought upon this poor man. And so when everything has been taken away from him, even his health, in the most radical and horrific ways, Job realizes that this too is at the hand of God. And so his wife says to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." And once again, what she says literally is bless God and die, but that's that Semitic polarity that often uses opposites, and you have to do that. You have to respect the fact that they don't want to bring the word curse and God in the same juxtaposition. But they intend that by it. It's the ability of these words to indicate their opposite. Curse God and die is the effect of what she's saying. Obviously, you curse God and you're worthy of death, and so she thinks that he might as well. He's as good as dead. I think it's interesting here too. This probably also comes at the agency of Satan, because he's the one that stirs up the wife. You can think of Eve, who was given to Adam to give life to the world, and the perverted intention of the enemy is to have Eve fall under the dominion of sin, and then to have her deliver the fruit to the man, to tempt him. Or the women in Genesis 6, the sons of God saw the daughters of man, that they were fair by their beauty. They subvert the world into a miscegenation of the good seed and the bad seed and bring about the judgment on the earth. You can think about Michal, the wife of David, who tempted him really in terms of, it tempted him because of his piety when he was dancing before the Lord. And she thought that was unbecoming, someone in the royal court, she who was brought up in the royal court. And so she mocks him. And for that, it's a great sin. God strikes her with barrenness. But he's oftentimes using women. He can also use men. Satan stirs up Peter to tempt the Lord by telling him that the things that he has announced after Peter's great confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, when Jesus discloses the fact that he must suffer all of the things that will come upon him that were foreseen in the Scripture, that he would be rejected by the religious and political leaders, that he would be delivered over to the Gentiles, that he would be scourged, he would be pierced. I can prove that. I haven't yet been able to prove crucifixion, but I can prove pierced. He would be buried, and then he would be raised on the third day. All of that was foreseen. When he announces that to the disciples and Peter takes him aside and says, "Oh, surely not for you. This can't be your destiny." And Jesus speaks right through. He sees the one who is behind Peter, his chief apostle, and he says to him, he calls him by name, Satan. He discloses the one who is hiding behind the mask of Peter, and Satan targets Peter, as we know. Jesus will tell him later that Satan had asked permission to sift him like wheat, and so Satan is the one who asks permission always to destroy the people of God. It's interesting in Revelation 12, when Satan is cast out of heaven, and that takes place at the triumphal entry, corresponding part in the gospel to that particular chapter 12. When that takes place, heaven rejoices that the accuser of the brethren has been cast down. He who, and the text says, had accused the brethren night and day. That is his labor. That's a comprehensive merism for all of time. Satan never rests. He's accusing us night and day. He would have to, actually, because half the earth is in night and half the earth is in day all the time. And so he is a spiritual being. He's not subject to weariness. He's constantly, his program is one of continual accusation. And I suspect he accuses us in the daytime. I suspect he accuses us in the night. That's his nature. That's his character. And so here he stirs up Job's wife. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? I mean, she's basically mocking his piety. And she had been the beneficiary of that for many, many years. And now it seems like she has no faith. She seems to be, she's willing for her husband to die. She's tempting him to curse God. And I think that certainly she would consent to that. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks." He doesn't call her a fool, and Naval is the word here. I think that, like Nabal, the husband of Abigail, I think that he doesn't call her a fool. He says, "You speak like one of the foolish women speaks," which is interesting. Shall we indeed accept good from the Lord and not accept adversity? Now, the text is shying away from reading what the Hebrew text says. And all of your English texts do this, for the ones that I can tell anyway, and that's unfortunate. The word adversity is not adversity, it's the normal word for evil. Shall we accept good from God, and shall we not accept evil? I understand the hesitation to attribute evil to God. That's what has been largely the subject of this discussion, but the text doesn't hesitate. In Lamentations 3, you find that. In Isaiah 45, God gives peace and he also gives evil. He creates it, we're told. Same within Lamentations. He gives peace, but he also gives evil. The word is evil. And I think we should render it that way. We just have to understand that he is not the source of evil, but he is using agents who, through their evil intent, God is accomplishing his good intent. And I think that's the ultimate purpose. Should we accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity or evil here? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, that seems to be restrictive to me. His lips are not sinning, but his heart is severely being tempted. I think that struggle will be worked out in the rest of the book. He does not publicly, he recognizes there's a difference between publicly and privately. And privately, I think he's, as we will see, he is raging in his unmitigated doubt and not understanding all of this. And when he comes to his exoneration section in 29 to 31, it's amazing. I mean, you can see the extent of, he's examining every part of his life, and he acquits himself. He says he has not sinned. And so why is God doing all of this to him? So anyway, but he did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of this adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Now we don't know exactly, some of these names like Teman and Zophar are associated with the children of Esau, and also of Keturah, one of the wives of Abraham. But we really don't know where they're from. They seem to be notable, certainly, and it almost seems like their fame would have been recognized in antiquity, but because they're mentioned by name in their place of origin, but we've long lost touch with that. But they're notable men for their allegiance, alleged allegiance, and probably authentic allegiance to the Lord God. For they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. So they asked for a time. They gave him a space of some time to absorb the shock of all of the grief in a very humane sense, I think. They were waiting for a time to come and had made an agreement. He was expecting them when they could come and mourn with him, and their intention was to comfort him. And so when they raised their eyes from afar, they did not recognize him. I suspect he's very scantily clad because that would be painful as well. And so he's sitting on an ash heap, covered in swords. Everything that he had was taken away from him. And so they assume, as we will see, that he must have done something severe in order to have brought this judgment upon himself, when actually the opposite is the case. It teaches us to be cautious in attributing cause and effect in this world. Sometimes we just can't do that. But anyway, they did not recognize him. They lifted up their voices and wept, and I think that's authentic. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. Probably a gesture of recognizing the frailty of any security in this life that can be so quickly and thoroughly taken away from us. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. I think that's fascinating. They sat down with him. They kept company with him days and nights. An entire Sabbath passed over them before any word was uttered. And Job is the one that will speak. I remember one of my very good friends back in Dallas, who was an elder in our church, had lost a daughter. I believe it was cancer. But in any case, he had lost his teenage daughter. She was 19. And he was a wonderful man, very sensitive. He and his wife, beautiful couple. But their daughter had died at 19. And he was telling me about the grief of that. He was a Calvinist man, and so he was very much aware of all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, as Paul says. He lived by that principle, loved that principle. But he told me, frankly, as he reflected back on that time, he said, people came from the church, they filled the house, they had food to feed an army, they were well beloved and well taken care of. And he said, he grew to the point where he wearied, and used stronger language than that, of hearing people recite that verse about all things working together for good. He said, I was just not in a place where that was comfort to me. And I understand that, I think, in as he explained it, and knowing him. That didn't mean that he didn't believe it. It didn't mean certainly that he didn't know that that was true. But there is a place in grief where the only thing you can do, and this is what he taught me, the only thing you can do in times of great loss to comfort a friend is to be with them and say nothing. Let them be the ones that initiate talk. He said a very good friend came over and simply answered the phone to keep them from having to rehearse all of their grief over and over again. He said that meant a lot to them too. So anyway, there are times when no words need to be spoken, but it is meaningful to be with someone, and that presence communicates so much to them. And I think it communicates to us as well, the presence of the Lord. I remember when Lazarus died, which was in the purposed intentions of God. The Lord came after Lazarus had died. Had he come before and healed him, they would have simply thought of Christ as a doctor, but he's so much more than a doctor. He came, he deliberately delayed in his time in Perea in order for the death and burial to take place, and in fact for the fourth day, when corruption sets in, to have transpired. And it's in that context when he comes and he sees his loved ones, he weeps with them. And when I was a boy, I couldn't understand that. Why did Jesus weep? We're told he wept 3 times. Why did he weep at the tomb of Lazarus when he knew that within the hour he was going to call Lazarus back from the dead? That didn't make sense to me as a boy. I think in reflecting on it over all of these years, I think what he's doing is he's sharing that moment in time with the ones he loves. And he's entering into the heartache of all of that, even though he knows exactly what he's going to do. And I think he's giving us an example to show us that tears of mourning are not contrary to faith. No one could accuse Christ of not having faith. And yet he wept. And I think that's important for us to keep that in mind. When we go through seasons of grief and we weep, that's authenticated by Christ himself. That is without sin. And it does not impugn our faith. It doesn't mean that our faith is weak. It's just the experience of humanity that Christ entered into himself and sanctified. Knowing, when Christians weep over their lost ones, we know that they will be raised. We know that they're with the Lord. And we know that there's no real occasion for weeping. I think that's why sometimes we call grave services or worship services and remembrance services, we call them celebration of life. I think there's some truth to that. In any case, our tears are certainly not contrary to our faith. They establish it. And so they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. That's a long time when he can't sleep himself. And they certainly could sleep, but they sat with him, enduring those long hours of an entire week in silence. I'm confident they would be praying for him. And when this is all over, he's going to be praying for them. So God has good purposes, and we should hold fast to that in confidence. Now, when we come to chapter 3, Job is the one who will open his mouth and speak.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. If you enjoyed this message, please be sure to like and subscribe to one of our channels so that you never miss an episode. We'd appreciate it if you could also leave us a review. You can find us on drwarrengage.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support the podcast and gain access to exclusive offers and content from Dr. Warren Gage, please visit our Patreon account at patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. We hope you join us next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast.